I read a statement from a victim, and he was saying, "I don't want to die, I don't want to die." And a witness had said James Ray told him it was a good day to die.
This is criminal. Someone in your care is in distress and you don't do anything? You walk away?
According to his own staff members, he didn't stick around to perform first aid or CPR on anybody he left.
Helicopters were arriving to medevac people to local hospitals, and he leaves the scene?
This is True Crime Arizona, the podcast.
It's October 2009. Ginny and Jean Brown knew it was the last day of Kirby's retreat she'd gone on with James Ray. They were eager to hear about it all, waiting for her call. She had driven to Sedona on a road trip, calling them along the way to catch up, so they knew they'd be hearing from her soon.
I was at work. At the time, I was just finishing up my master's degree in public policy, so I was working for Health Canada in Ottawa.
Jean's day hadn't been unusual until her husband showed up at her work. That was random and unusual. He had an odd look on his face.
My husband just said there's been some kind of accident, and my parents had called my husband and had him drive to get me at work and tell me because they didn't want me to be alone when I found out.
Found out what? What Jean didn't know was earlier that morning, her mom woke up to an unexpected visitor with information about Kirby that would turn their family's world upside down.
On Friday, October 9th, a state trooper came to our door at 8:15 in the morning to tell us that she had passed in a sweat lodge in Sedona, Arizona.
Okay, what's the problem?
2 people not breathing. There was no pulse.
It was one of the most bizarre nights in the newsroom because we heard some traffic over the scanner, but it was so unclear what was going on up there. One report said it was like a hazmat situation with a lot of people involved. There was another call that said it was a mass casualty event. We had no idea what was going on.
No, it was a sweat lodge.
A sweat lodge?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, are you there by yourself?
No, there's a lot of people here.
Jared Dillingham was in the 3TV newsroom. It was late. Normally his reporter shift would have been ending soon. But the newsroom assignment desk knew whatever was happening in Sedona was a big deal. So Jared and a photographer headed up that way.
And we say Sedona, this is like between Cornville and Sedona on a rural road, like off the main highway there. So this is in the middle of nowhere.
This call initially came in through 911 from what I remember as an emergency medical call in the Sedona area. What caught my attention was the amount of victims. It was mass trauma kind of medical distress.
Scott Masher rushed to the scene too. He was an investigator for the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. He was so good, he'd go on to become sheriff years later.
Had you heard of something like that in Sedona before?
No. We heard that there were actually people who were deceased and over a dozen people that were going to need hospitalization. So it was one of those calls where you don't know what's going on, but obviously now law enforcement needs to be involved. So yeah, we had deputies respond to the scene along with the medical to try to determine, this is mass casualty, what's going on.
Did you know what it was from yet?
No, not at all.
So what was your guess?
I had no idea. I mean, in the Sedona area, you have a lot of the self-help, spiritual kind of things, and this sounded like it was a lot of people at some kind of outdoor retreat and were in serious medical conditions.
Jared got to Angel Valley and was even more confused.
Pitch black at night. It was roped off with police tape. We saw ambulances coming and going, but we had no idea what was happening there.
Jared was behind the crime tape. On the other side was Scott. They quickly learned 2 people were dead at the scene.
They didn't know if it was a cult situation, a mass suicide. They had no idea.
There were deputies there. There were people laying in the dirt. There were people sitting there. There were people crying. A lot of people, 50 plus people.
People on the ground outside this big tent, walking around, some of them with their hair buzzed. They were hallucinating.
There were people in such various stages of medical distress. I mean, there were people that were unconscious, there were people laying in the dirt, there were people crying, and it started to come in that it seemed heat related.
Ambulances were coming in and out.
Heat illness, heat exhaustion, heat stroke.
Helicopters were life-flighting people to hospitals.
This is all unfolding right then, and people needed help. It was pretty chaotic. There was a lot of medical staff there, and I thought, gosh, there must be all the medical first responders from that whole Sedona area. I think I actually called the medical examiner and gave him a heads up that this is a mass trauma. We had some people who were deceased.
In the dead of night, the focus was first and foremost getting people medical help.
I think almost 20 people went to the hospital because of this sweat lodge.
Nobody really knew what this sweat lodge was. As the sun started to come up in the early morning hours, for the first time, you could actually see what was out there, and that's when the investigation really began. The news station had its chopper flying above, taking bird's eye video. Jared was looking at the new footage on the ground.
The next morning, we flew our helicopter over the scene, and we still didn't know what we were looking at down below. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I remember thinking as the helicopter flew over, it looked like the set of the TV show Lost. Like people who had survived a plane crash gathered all the tarps and blankets from the wreckage and created a shelter and were living in it. And we soon came to find out that shelter was the sweat lodge, which had been used in this ceremony, which had turned deadly the night before. And also, as I was looking at the helicopter footage that morning, I remember thinking it's so low to the ground, maybe it collapsed. And that's what caused all these people to die and get injured and sent to the hospital. It was so low to the ground. It was like 4 feet, maybe 5 feet tall. And come to find out, that's the way it was built and that's the way it was designed. There was no way anyone adult could walk through there.
It's kind of a race to put puzzle pieces together of what this is, why people were hurt, and what unfolded overnight. Scott Masher says their deputies learned the structure was a sweat lodge as part of a spiritual retreat led by self-help guru James Arthur Ray.
Did you ever talk to James Ray?
No,
Where did he go?
I did not see him there.
So you're there with the chaos and the person who hosted this retreat up and left.
From what I was told, he went to his room. I had not seen him, talked to him. We had detectives who were coming to take that part of the case over, but no, I did not see him.
When you got to the scene and you're assessing everything, was it apparent at first that this was going to be a homicide case?
You know, you don't know. You don't assume. You just start gathering evidence and trying to figure out what's going on.
While many participants were too sick to function, there were some in better shape than others. They started talking to investigators, telling them how they had done a vision quest with no food or water for days, and that the final event was somewhat of an endurance test, the sweat lodge, where for many rounds lasting 20 minutes or so, water would be poured on hot rocks and the lodge would become insanely hot. Details started to unravel about what was said in that sweat lodge during the activity.
The detectives gaining enough information and presenting that to the county attorney's office on how reckless it seemed to be, that people were asking for help who wanted help and they were told to toughen up. You know, you're going to go into another level of consciousness. You're not going to die. I read a statement from a victim who was drug out, who thought he was having a heart attack, and he didn't want to die. He was saying, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. And a witness had said James Ray told him it was a good day to die.
Do you think that these people who were there were either manipulated by James Ray or in such a vulnerable spot that they felt they had no way to leave this retreat if they thought there was some sort of danger?
I think they relied on him for this, you know, spiritual healing. And they paid a lot of money. I think it was upwards of $10,000. And they wanted to listen to him, to believe in him. But they were compelled to listen and stay in that lodge, in the sweat lodge. And he was adamant that they do so. They wanted out and you're telling them no. And that's pretty reckless.
Everyone is getting different information as the hours go on. Jared was reporting live outside the nearby hospital where many of the participants were taken to. That's when he starts to learn more.
Eventually I was doing live shots outside the hospital nearby because we knew 2 people had died that night. Many people were still in the hospital. One of them would go on to die days later. And while I was doing live shots at the hospital, someone came outside and said to me it was the Spiritual Warrior Retreat. I don't know who the person was. I'd never heard of Spiritual Warrior, but I looked it up online. I found the brochure for that treat and it had the name James Arthur Ray on it. That was the first time we had any reporting which linked James Ray to this deadly retreat. That night, according to the participants, he was nowhere to be found when it became clear that this was a deadly disaster. He did not, according to his own staff members, he didn't stick around to perform first aid or CPR on anybody. He left.
Did he know how to perform CPR or first aid?
It's unclear, but we do know he had a prior incident where someone fell sick at a sweat lodge years before, and he said after that he was going to make some changes. He was going to have a nurse on hand, he was going to have someone who knew CPR on hand, and he was going to dial the intensity back. Did he? I don't know.
Connie Joy is back at her home in Hawaii. Remember, James was upset with her because she and her husband would not be going to Spiritual Warrior in 2009. She saw too many red flags. She gets a call from a friend, a fellow student of James Ray's, who had also done the sweat lodge before.
It's serious that there's people that are hurt. We're like, oh, there's people hurt every year. He said, no, Connie, they're doing CPR and helicopters are coming in. And I just looked up and I said, where's Steve, our friend? Somebody find him. Where is he? So we're trying to contact him. And then it was later that we found out he was the first one lighted out.
The names of those in the hospital weren't known for a while, but everyone learned the names of the 2 who died inside the sweat lodge, James Shore and Kirby Brown.
What I learned was that people had told Ray that she was in trouble. She was breathing funny, and he did nothing. He did nothing. He didn't stop the event. He didn't check on her. He said, well, we'll check on her when this round of chanting of 15 or 20 minutes is over. We'll check on her then. And he never did. And he never did.
Jenny was horrified learning about her daughter's final moments. How could anyone allow this to happen?
There was all this information, and I'm like, this is crazy. This is criminal. Someone in your care is in distress, and you don't do anything. You walk away. He wound up going up to his room and showering and having something to eat while the police were trying to figure out what the heck had happened. Helicopters were arriving to medevac people to local hospitals, and he leaves the scene. When you look at a 5-day influence of the kinds of things that he did over the course of that retreat in Sedona, it's very clear that there was real mind control that was taking place. And by the time they got to that sweat lodge, I don't know that any of them had full rational capacity.
Kirby's sister Jean couldn't wrap her head around it all. I mean, if anyone knew how to deal with heat, it was Kirby.
She lived in Mexico, and she also practiced Bikram yoga, which is typically done at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So, she knew heat. She knew how to handle heat, and she also knew, I think even more importantly than her experience with heat, she knew how to protect herself in heat. We learned about that being out in the desert without food or water, and it started to become more clear why physically she wouldn't have been able to handle the sweat lodge. He was priming people to ignore the physical signs of their own distress.
Would you call that manipulation?
Yeah, for sure.
Jared would interview a woman days later named Shauna Bowen, who was nearby and ran over to the sweat lodge to help in any way she could. It was an eye-opening perspective. Somebody who had no stake in the game, who just jumped in to help.
There was kind of dirt just everywhere, mud everywhere. They had tried to hose some of the people down to cool them off, and one of my other friends had said that, she said, Shauna, it was bizarre when we hosed them down, it was like steam was just coming off of them.
Can you describe the condition of the people who are outside, maybe passed out or suffering on the ground?
A lot of shivering, goosebumps, kind of like can't stand up, can't sit up.
Did you see James Arthur Ray outside the sweat lodge when you got there?
Yeah.
What was he doing?
He was near the sweat lodge, standing.
You would describe his demeanor as?
Shocked, kind of concerned. At one point when one of the women that I was tending to, she was kind of asking for James Ray and kind of calling for him.
Did he stop to help people? Did you see him bending down to help anybody?
I did not personally see him bend down or get on his knees to help anyone. I did not see James for the rest of the night, and I don't know when he ended up leaving.
It became apparent from participants that where James sat in the sweat lodge made all the difference. He was the one more or less monitoring who was going in or out, certainly controlling the situation.
James Ray sat by the flap. There was one entrance, one exit. He sat by the flap, so he had access to fresh air, while the participants inside would say, 20 minutes, half hour into this, it felt like I was breathing fire.
Some people did get hosed down with water outside the lodge between rounds. James certainly did, but not everyone.
There were several people who were incapable physically of making that decision to leave. Some of the participants inside said, you were told to ignore the vomiting, ignore the people who'd passed out, and just carry on with the ceremony. James Arthur Ray said to these people as they were going in, this is going to be hotter than hot. He said to them, you may feel like you're dying, but push through it. You're bigger than this. You're better than this. Mind over matter. That was his mantra this whole week. Push through it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but this is the path to spiritual awakening and to cleansing your mind, body, and spirit. So he, according to the participants, was almost bullying people to stay inside. People who maybe went to leave, it was like they didn't want to be looked down upon by James Arthur Ray, who was sitting at the flap of the door. They trusted him. They trusted him.
Nobody saw James. He didn't talk to anyone, but he put out a cryptic tweet. This was still in the day when Twitter was kind of new, just starting to gain popularity.
Earlier in the day, Ray posted a comment online that has since been removed. On his Twitter page, he wrote, quote, "For anything new to live, something must die." He goes on to ask, what needs to die in you so that new life can emerge?
Connie Joy was angry. She knew exactly how James acted in that sweat lodge and how this happened.
If people are yelling at James that, could say Kirby was in trouble, she's not breathing right, and he says, oh, we'll deal with that at the end of the next round. I mean, she's laying there all that time, and the other people probably did not have the strength or the energy or the ability to get her out earlier. This was just horrible. The worst words we could hear from it. And I remember looking up at my husband saying, he literally begged them to death. He did that. He did it. Even after all the warnings, he did it.
Scott Masher was still working the investigative side of things.
I went to the medical examiner's office. Kirby Brown was there, and he had already done a visual examination of her, and he told me that it definitely looked like a hyperthermia case just from the initial examination of the body. In Arizona, whether you're down in the valley hiking Camelback Mountain or up in Sedona hiking or wherever, there are various stages of heat illness, starting out, with just starting to get overheated, going into heat exhaustion, and going into heat stroke, which is very deadly. Their own body was telling them that I got to get out of here, and he was telling them, no, you're going to feel like you're going to die, but you won't.
And then they did.
And they did. If there would have been proper medical staff, a safety plan in place to deal with heat, hypothermic related issues, this could have been, I think, prevented.
Back on the East Coast, the Brown family was still in shock. They were devastated. Kirby, who had been full of life and love, was gone. They agreed with Scott. Every single part of this was preventable, yet it would be days before they would even hear from James.
What was your interpretation of James Ray's demeanor toward all of this?
Yeah, so I think by this Sunday after it had happened, within a few days after it had happened, I was at my parents' house, and we were kind of like just waiting for a phone call, waiting for anything from James Ray.
When he finally called me, James Ray, on the Tuesday after this had happened, 5 days later, to tell me how shocked he was and how upset he was.
Finally, he did call our house, and my mom took the call, and we all kind of sat around watching her take this phone call and listening. I think she had it on speaker so we could all hear. And the thing that really stuck with me was that he said, "This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me." And right then it was like, oh man, you're making this all about you already.
He doesn't seem to understand that all the things he did made death inevitable at the event. If you had only called me that night and said, "Oh my God, I can't believe this terrible thing happened. What can we do? How can we help you?" We had to transport her body from Arizona. We had to make arrangements for her things to be brought back to New York. He doesn't get it, or he doesn't care. So what's more dangerous? He's either sociopathic or he's delusional.
While most who were in the hospital did recover, one person did not.
We knew right away that James Shaw had died with her, and then Liz Newman actually died 9 days later, the day that we were burying Kirby.
Liz Newman. She was also pretty involved in James's life and events. This wasn't her first time in the sweat lodge. In fact, at first, she too was helping people that night.
Ironically, according to police interview transcripts, Liz Newman was one of 3 people responsible for pulling out participants who passed out in the sweat lodge.
She couldn't pull through in the ICU. Her daughter, Andrea Puckett, spoke to our station after her mom died.
I think about my mom every day. I cry every day, and just dealing with it from moment to moment, trying to get back to a normal life.
I've talked to Andrea both on the phone and over text as I've been gathering details for this investigation. She lives in Minnesota. She is so nice and has been nothing but helpful and welcoming to me as a journalist working on this story. In fact, everyone has. These victims came from great families and left behind loved ones who are determined to make a difference from this. It makes what happened next in the story even more asinine to everyone, especially those close to the victims.
And with people still in the hospital from this sweat lodge retreat, he went on his speaking tour. He started showing up and giving his speeches. Immediately, he fell under intense criticism and pressure, and he cut that tour short. But people found it pretty incredible that he left Sedona and carried on with his business life.
Yep, James Ray left Arizona after this tragedy and continued on with public appearances, still speaking on how to spiritually make a better life for yourself. Jared remembers families were more or less livid, and that was understandable.
They ended up considering James Arthur Ray an irresponsible narcissist who really didn't know what he was doing and lacked remorse. I mean, the fact that he left and continued on the speaking tour, people were astounded by that.
When I heard he went back on tour right after, I had so many questions. I wanted to know his demeanor. I mean, how do you carry on with your life and business knowing the pinnacle of all your events just ended in the deaths of 3 people and trauma for so many more? I couldn't find video of James on stage after, but there is a first-hand account. Connie Joy went to that first event back because she too was confused how James could go on.
And I had said earlier in an email to all of her friends, I said, okay, this is where we're going to see how a master handles a tragedy. And we're either going to be enlightened or we're going to be terribly disappointed. It was about a week later I sent out an email. All I said in the email was, I'm terribly disappointed.
It was the first time Connie had seen or spoken to James since their disagreement. What she witnessed of James that day has stuck with her to her core.
When I hugged him, I didn't get a natural emotion. It's kind of hard to describe unless you're an empath. I didn't get an emotion. It was blank, and that was startling to me. And then my husband's like, well, of course, and, we go sit down. But we talked a little bit, and we talked a little bit during that event. But it just confirmed. In fact, there was one point where somebody slipped him a note, which you don't go up in the middle of him doing a talk, and slip him a note about something. We thought, and everybody's head turned, I thought for sure the police are here and he's arrested. But he just stuck the note underneath his pad there and kept right on going. And we believe that note told him that our friend Liz Newman had passed. So that was the last time I spoke with him.
The tour was cut short. What would come next captivated much of America. Inside a courtroom in rural Arizona, witnesses would speak out. Those who were inside that lodge, those who narrowly survived. What was said in that courtroom would change the entire case, but not in the way many would have thought.
I'm waiting for this powerful man to be accountable for what happened.
Next time on True Crime Arizona, the Sedona Sweat Lodge deaths.
I said 5 or 6 times, there's something wrong, she needs to be taken out.
At trial, it came out that other people had been injured at these events.
What would you do if you knew right now that the person next to you was dying? We'd say, Judge, we need to stop this proceeding immediately.
Court documents show he's more than $4 million in debt.
My client has no criminal history whatsoever.
There was a lot of screaming going on. James said, quiet down, I'm in charge here. Everyone needs to be quiet right now.
True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney, and produced by Sergio Hernandez. It's a production of Arizona's Family, 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.